She sells by the seashore. Oh yeah. Wait, what's a good tongue twister to test out your talking? Things to say before a podcast. Testing audio. Test phrases. Here we go. That's called a microphone. It's a big sausage that picks up everything you say, and you're starting early. I don't care what No Prince says. It's not my fault he's thinking about sausages when he sees a microphone. The small pup gnawed a hole in the sock. That's a good tongue twister. The colt reared and threw the tall rider. See, these kinds of things make you think about how you're saying things. The swan dive was far short of perfect. The beauty of the view stunned the young person. The two blue fish swam in the tank. I feel like I could be a voice actor, but I really don't want to be. It seems like it'd be fun for a day or two, and then it would just be like super drudgery, I guess. Alright, anyways, on to the main topic. So, thinking about if I'm babbling and I don't care, or I don't, what's the phrase you want? I want. If there's a topic that's hard to mess up, and especially when you're talking about spiritual stuff, what would you talk about? You can talk about fossils, you can talk about all kinds of things, your past, that's an easy one. Nostalgia. But hardly anything is worth more praise, in my opinion, than rivers. And I know a lot of people nowadays are disconnected from nature. They don't really realize it. They overlook it. Think they're too big and scary, or too boring and slow. Well, it really depends on the river, the size of the river. There's all kinds of rivers, but they're all just one system anyways. Because how do you define a river, really? Besides, it's a body of water, it's long, and it's moving, right? I'll get into how everything's interconnected, but just for the sake of descriptions right now, and praise, I guess, barely anything is as foreboding, yet majestic, life-giving, yet life-taking as a river. Hey, think about it. I saw this online. Apparently, rivers only take up 0.1% of the planet, but yet it's one of the things we focus on more than any other type of feature on any landscape, because they're so integral to our evolution, survival, and just recreation and fun in general, right? It's no joke that there's skits about living in a van down by the river, right? That's a way to go if you have a primitive lifestyle. Once society collapses, if it does, shall I say, to be more politically correct, if society collapsed, it'd be much more advisable to live by a river than in the middle of a barren city. So we're always going to have a spiritual connectedness to it. And I'm not just saying this because I'm biased, because I like the outdoors and I live fairly close to a river. Still haven't fished out of it for some reason. But that's neither here nor there. And that's good for right now. But really, there's no hard definition of what a river is. Just like what's a pond versus what's a lake. What's a small lake versus a large pond, you know. I've thought about it and researched, and there's really no dividing line. And what's the dividing line between a big creek and a small river, you know? I think I saw something about the smallest river on the planet. I think it had something to do with it being a river rise, where it originates out of another river or something like that. But it's really impossible. It's like, what's the largest island, right? You have to define something big enough to be a continent. Australia is not an island because apparently it's so big it's a continent. I'm not going to get into the logistics of technically all lands are islands. No, they're once it surpasses a certain point, like, it's definitely not an island, just because you're surrounded by water. I guess you could technically define it as if you're miles and miles and miles away from any body of water, which before I quit Reddit, I had heard it's somewhere in Asia that's the furthest from the ocean, or maybe it's on YouTube. And there were people from that country saying, yeah, I hope one day to see ocean one day. And I'm thinking, I'm living in Florida. The max distance from an ocean or Gulf is like 50 to 55 miles. So, and I'm sure there's still Floridians that have never seen ocean or beach, which is surprising yet not surprising. But anyways, back on topic. What feels like on topic. Right. Okay. So, rivers, how do they originate? Well, first, so how did they come about? How old are they? I guess you could technically date it back and speculate based on how climate and sea level fluctuated. But once you go back a certain point, you're just spiritually disconnected from most everything. Right? Because landscapes change all the time, but as far as our intuitions are concerned, rivers have practically existed forever. As far as our intuitions can go. Natural intuition. They've seen many species come and go. And in the grand scheme of things, the end Pleistocene extinctions that wiped out the woolly mammoths, saber cats, ground sloths, all that fun stuff, fun yet dangerous stuff that would kill me, kill any of us, but I can't anymore, but are integral to our evolution and how our psychology works nowadays, for better or worse. Right? I think a lot of people actually would prefer living in those times because our operating systems are meant for those kinds of environments. That's what I don't get about so many podcasts. They don't allow deviation, or if there are fun deviations, they say, no, back on topic. Like, this whole thing about talking about stuff, whether it's fiction or reality or some kind of blur between the two, it's all just a dance anyways. You don't know everything. Might as well just enjoy it versus trying to be perfectly accurate all the time. That just kills it. Kills all the fun. Because no matter what I say, the more I try to be factual, the more I'll be wrong in the future. So it really defeats the purpose if you're doing things just to be accurate versus just trying to be fun and realize things. I'm not saying never be serious in podcasts and educational stuff in general. And I really realized that with my education, and especially with the history of life course, where things are so much speculation, so many things are changing all the time. Like my professor, and especially I could tell he was not very, he knew generally about everything, but nobody knows everything about most things in paleontology with so much speculation. It's not that he was walking on eggshells, just he was saying the current evidence says this. And I remember even a year or two after taking that course, there were things he taught that were not necessarily perfectly accurate. And he probably knew that things change all the time. The genus names change all the time. The events, causes of mass extinctions, speculating changes. But it's more about the methods. And he really enforced that science has methods of testing and finding out evidence, and what does the evidence seem to point toward, versus coming to a conclusion and then saying, what evidence shall I accept, what evidence shall I ignore that goes with my agenda? Because that's just backwards thinking. You need to go from the bottom up. You don't look in a forest trying to find something I mean, you can if you found it there before, but you don't go into a forest saying, I'm going to look for a domestic horse, and if I don't find a domestic horse, then it's not a forest. You know? Yeah. So, look at a river. Where did it come from? It came from some kind of spring, glacier, swamp. And we could say, okay, I want to explore the whole river. So I'll start at the swamp, take my kayak, and go all the way to where it ends and dumps into another river, a lake, or wherever it goes to. Okay, so start at the east end. Let's just say, for all intents and purposes, we're exploring the Sante Fe River. Okay, so some creeks start joining together, and it creates the Sante Fe River. Now, where exactly the creeks end and the river start, that's arbitrary, but for our purposes, somebody decided where the creeks end and the river starts. So that's where it starts. And you go. Eventually, it empties into the so-called Swanee River. Okay, I explored the whole river. End of story. But the river's still there, right? Not only that, but the water replaced itself. So not only did you not explore the river behind you, it's a whole new river, right? If you defined a river by the water it is, it constantly changes. It constantly dies and becomes a new river. Because the water empties out to another river. So if you want to be technical about it, you never explore that river. If enough time passes, you can say, okay, it's the land. Well, we agreed that rivers are water, not land. So what did you do there? You explored a dead river. But really, it was the river. If you want to say that the spring makes the river, but it constantly rebirths itself. And it's just an endless loop of you did explore the river, you didn't explore the river. And it just constantly fluctuates, or not fluctuates, vibrates between the two truths. And it seems paradoxical, but it's not. Because really, there are no paradoxes. They're just problems that seem paradoxical, but they're really just unresolved. Just look at the coastline paradox. People say, how can this be? There's only so much finite land on Earth, but if you measure the coastline, depending on the measurement, it can approach infinity. Of course, we all know infinity is just a concept. It's not a real thing. But at the same time, we know that our intestines are super coiled, and if they were ever uncoiled, they would be way longer than our bodies. So coiling has that effect where you can add a lot of length by coiling. So that's what's happening with coastline. So really, it's not a paradox, because the more twists and turns you have, you can fit more into a smaller area. That's all that is, right? As you're getting better with the measurement, you're just approaching the limit. You're not approaching infinity. It may seem like it for super bendy rivers, and creeks, or coasts, whatever you're measuring. But really, that's all you're doing. And the same with heaps of sand, right? You start with a heap of sand, take away individual grains of sand. Eventually, you have one left. How is it still? It's still a heap, but it's not a heap. Well, it depends on what you're defining as a heap. How much volume or how many grains of sand are in a heap. So really, it's not a paradox, because it's all just definitions. But people think it's paradox because there's no definition of what a heap is. It's just enough sand. But what is enough sand? Actually, let's back up for a minute. Let's appreciate the fact that truly living can be done through doing such simple things as floating down a river. Because you're not finding food, you're not finding a mate, you're not doing exactly anything to promote survival, but yet you're finding spiritual, emotional relief, if not fun, through the relaxation, and the experience of floating down a river. Just let that sink in. Why is this? In a life that tells us you must live, 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 you must see as many movies, read as many books as you can, but yet the more we do that, the more we feel drained, and the less we get out of the substances or the material. So what truly is living? What do you have to do? It's all subjective. But yet some people have it figured out better than others. Well, at least for our fairly primitive operating system. That's for sure. So as it's unclear where a river exactly starts, say it starts in the spring, then the spring is part of the river, and the spring is under the river, underground. Is it practically a river? I guess you could say if it had features of a river, if it had enough fish, if it had enough influence, that it really. And actually on the Sante Fe River, there are parts where the river does go underground. You have sinks, so it really blurs the line. Although there are technical terms like river sinks or underground river or whatever they call it. But I want to check it out one day, that's for sure. Probably don't want to get too close. Actually, I've been near the Sante Fe, at least a couple of the siphons on the Rum 138. Cannot recommend that enough. I didn't make any reservations or anything. I just showed up trying to find some Eocene shark teeth. Didn't find any that day. Probably needed to be by the rapids that were cutting through the super ancient stuff. Actually, there was one part of the river that looked like it had marine fossils. But anyways, I kept moving, and overall I got much more fulfillment from enjoying the natural ecosystem and the scenery of the here and now versus the fossilized stuff. You can still find a lot of joy out of that from the speculations and your imagination and stuff. But really, our intuitions are built for the here and now. I mean, to each their own. I certainly fluctuate, but if you're not fluctuating in life, what are you doing? Doing the same things over and over and over. You think that's going to bring your life fulfillment? So it's clear as day that the origin of a river, where it definitely starts, just like with birth or the start of a life, whether it starts at conception, your birth, a certain stage in pregnancy, it's all relative and subjective. Of course, for legal purposes, it's when you popped out into the external world, but it's all arbitrary, and it's a constant cycle of life, death. Even if the single entity isn't reincarnated or doesn't continue after death, there's definitely life that continues onward. And it really doesn't matter, just as in a river, if it evaporates, if it ends up at the end of the river, if it is taken out by another animal and goes onto dry land and the water molecules end up on land somehow, it doesn't matter. The river still exists. And same with life. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't care about us. And that's the big joy of it. And the thing we overlook. We are minuscule. Yet, fortunate enough to be witness to all of it. Or a lot of it. A lot more than what people realize. How much knowledge is out there. How much of the world there is to explore. How much freedom there is. But they're caught up in their negative traps. And that's a whole nother topic I didn't mean to touch on. But, when you're having fun, you can cover so many things. So much ground. So you're floating down what's definitely now the Sante Fe River. You see all the springs and all the siphons and all the crazy stuff. And if you're ballsy enough and you have enough time and energy, you eventually reach what's consider the Swanee River, even though there's rivers before it that dump into it. But anyways, so I'm looking at a drawing here I made of the whole region. You have the Sante Fe River going east to west, Swanee River pretty much going northeast to, from the northeast going to the southwest until it eventually dumps into the Gulf of Mexico. So I've thought about this before. Where the Sante Fe River dumps into the Swanee River, does it become a new river because it has water sources from both locations? Or is it just a continuation of the Swanee River? It can't be denied that the Sante Fe was integrated into the Swanee River and definitely influences it, not just because it dumps water. It probably has interchange of fauna, of those kind of ideas and influences. Not only that, also there's probably stuff from the Swanee River that goes up the Sante Fe River. I don't know for sure. It might be super quick, and I don't know. But I'm just speculating here. So after the confluence, the joining of the two, does it become a new river? Of course, for definition's sake, it's technically still the Swanee River. But you have influences such as exchange of nutrients, exchange of fish, fauna, all kinds of influences between the two. So is there really a dividing line? Or for definition's sake, for being logical and saying, okay, this dumps into that, and it's definitely distinct, so it must be a separate entity. But really, if it dumps into each other, it's practically the same thing. So why do we call a river, once it dumps into another river and becomes a separate entity, it's still the main entity if you trace it? Well, you have to make those kind of definitions for at least map making. But here's what's going to blow your mind, or might. It's the same thing in real life, that one event never really ends because it leads to other events. And you can't really trace where an event ends because the effects of it continue. And it continues to domino and domino. And you never know where one event ends because it influenced the effects of the next result, which influenced the results of the next event, and so on and so on. And so really, nothing really dies because the effects continue. That's really reassuring, especially going through grief and just life in general, and realizing that everything is interconnected. There's cycles that seemingly never end, constant rebirth and death, not just with time and nutrients, organisms. It's all just a cycle. And we can be caught up in our selfish ways and saying that we started when we were born and we end when we die. Even if that's logically true, it's not really true in a spiritual sense, even in a spiritual earthy sense, because we have no idea how we influence other people and they influence other people. And I know that it can lead to paranoia maybe, but it's also reassuring, and it really hones in on why we have to be freaking decent human beings, and not allow other people to overly influence us. We have to keep a level head. And it's easier said than done sometimes. So many factors. But as long as we have faith, holy crap, it feels much later than 9 o'clock. But I'm having fun. Been listening to some good videos, being influenced a little bit, but I probably would have come to this conclusion eventually anyways. So what's really the harm? No harm, no foul, right? I have fun talking about nature and rivers, all kinds of stuff. Just the more connections you make in general, the better off you'll be. And some truths are hard to accept, but the deeper you dig, the more sense it makes, the more you realize that life is a game, and it's just a way to have fun, right? Because we don't realize how good it feels to be alive unless we don't have life. Or we just realize that it's all a game. And why not just play it under your rules? You know, as long as you're living sustainably, why not just enjoy it just for the heck of it? And don't be overly attached to things. And just know that everything has a starting and ending, quote unquote, as I touched on.